Hello, everyone. I hope you're all settled down. Uh, So for those of you who are online, we're still settling down a little bit in the class. And there's going to be a little bit of a disruption because one of the LTs is going to come a bit later. Okay, so today's lecture is going to focus on corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. And in today's session, we will talk about how corporate social responsibility, legal compliance, and stakeholder expectations can interplay with each other. And we're going to also talk about how environmental compliance can sometimes be related to operational excellence. And in general, you'll see throughout the entire program of the entire international business law program that compliance in general is a good way to ensure operational excellence anyway, because it's just the baseline for making sure that you have proper processes in place. And if you're a really good organization, you will want to be as proactive as possible. Have any of you ever heard about mindfulness meditation?
In Buddhism, yes.
In Buddhism, okay. What is mindfulness meditation about?
Yes, ma'am. As I can remember, I think that you are aware of your emotions, thoughts, feelings, and that these feelings, thoughts, emotions, they're like coming in like a stream, and the ability to understand that would be advantageous to one's well-being. That's how I remember, ma'am.
Yes. So, growing up, I used to think about meditation and mindfulness as being, okay, I should have no thoughts in my head at all, right? And I should be completely clear of any outside distractions. And guess what? Does that work in real life? No, because you're just denying that there are problems with the external actors you have around you. And you're just basically in denial about your life and your problems, right? And so the thing with mindfulness meditation is that you accept the thoughts as they come, you acknowledge them, and then you let them pass, right? And that is a very different way of thinking about solving a problem, right? And so what, when we start teaching compliance in general, what we're taught is that compliance is mindfulness for organizations, right? You are not trying to deny that there's a problem. You accept it and you take it in and then you let it pass, right? So that's what it is. When you're in denial, it doesn't mean that there is no problem. It's still going to be there. You're not actually addressing the risks that you have. So this session is going to draw upon that, right? So there's a connection between compliance and operational excellence. And you can see this at the organizational level as well. Have you ever heard about the Gulf of Mexico oil spill? The BP oil spill that happened at the Gulf of Mexico. Has anyone ever heard about it? Yes?
I can vaguely remember, ma'am, but yeah.
Okay. Does anyone remember the details a little bit more than vaguely? I saw Carol nodding her head.
I just heard it before, but don't remember the specific anymore.
AJ?
Probably you're asking me about the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, the BP oil spill.
I heard that one on the news, yeah, but in-depth detail, I'm very keen.
Just tell me about broadly what happened in that. What was the oil spill about?
As I recall,
Yes.
it's been a long time ago. There was negligence
Mhm.
from the stakeholders of the oil company,
Mhm.
and spoils out to the Gulf of Mexico, and it spoils the environment extremely bad. And there was a fire case. That's all I could recall, Prof. Sorry about that.
That's good enough, right? So there's an oil spill that BP is responsible for at the Gulf of Mexico. And this oil spill goes on for around 90 days or so. So 90 days is 3 months, right? And what's happening is that this oil is getting pumped up into the sea. Who's getting affected by this?
I think of course, the animals, the marine environment, of course, also the farmers or the fishermen
Fishermen.
who feed on those fish.
Right? Is the company getting affected? Okay. And more immediately in the company, who's getting affected?
Leaders of the company,
Only leaders? Nobody
uh,
else?
including the community around the Gulf of Mexico, the states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when this oil spill happens, there is a blast and immediately there are employees that die. And so you see that there's an environmental disaster, but there's also a human risk. And how does this end up happening? Well, before the spill has happened, the top management puts really tight deadlines on the engineering team and tells them that you have to do this by a certain time. And the engineering team is overworked. They are not sure that they'll be able to do it. And normally what happens when they do these extractions is that they have to put some sort of a layer of cement and, close the drills when they finish the process. And they're also put under pressure to do this in a way that is the most cost effective, right? And so what ends up happening is that there's a cheap quality cement that's used, and the engineering team has been telling them for a while, you're asking us to do something that is a bit too complicated, too quick, and it isn't feasible. And the top management is pushing forward because they've had near misses in the past, right? And they've gotten lucky where there could have been an oil spill, but the winds were blowing in the right direction, and so there was no blast, and they get lucky, and so they're like, you know what? We've had this situation before, and we've been lucky in the past, so we're just gonna work around it, right? In this particular case, that doesn't happen. That day when that evening when that blast happens, they don't get lucky, right? And so there's an organizational risk that they took that immediately affected their employees, but also their environment, right? And so this is a watershed moment, right, for environmental compliance. And what ends up happening is that there's the Obama administration in place at that time. And they put in a series of regulations around oil companies. And these regulations involve having simulations and tests that are put in place before that have to be conducted before any drilling or any oil extraction operations or any energy extraction processes are put into place. And these have to be conducted by you have to demonstrate to the Department of Justice, the SEC at the US level, that these are in fact like risk-free programs and will not cause damage to the environment, will not cause damage to your, like, you know, physical harm to your employees, and will not affect and will not include any misstatements about how about how the board is conducting its oversight of company operations, right? So this is like one example of how, you know, so what needs to happen? It means that at the, you know, there was the BP ends up paying around, I think it was like almost $1 billion or something dollars in damages, right? There's the environmental hazard of this, right? But what that tells you is that the event was a reflection of something that was happening at the company level that was wrong. Right? There were serious issues with the company's management that they were ignoring. So there was no mindfulness there.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Ma'am, in the Philippines, we have reckless imprudence. So it's kind of like that. Although it's not illegal to do that, but because they did that, it resulted in damage to life and to property because of recklessness.
So the SEC will come after you here in the Philippines as well. The Department of Energy and Natural Resources will also hold you compliant, right? In some cases, DOLE will come after you, telling you that you are not compliant with our labor and employment regulations, right? So there are a whole bunch of issues that you could end up facing. And why? Because you were just involved at that time. You were just concerned with cutting costs, making a profit, and doing things as quickly as possible, right? In the process of doing this. So what you need to do at that time is, or even before these things happen, is that you need to have proper organizational structures in place. And how do you end up doing that? Like, how could, in the BP example, what could the company have done differently?
So by just listening to the facts or the facts mentioned here,
Mhm.
maybe they could have listened more to the engineers, um, maybe review the reports on safety matters, especially safety, to have prevented this disaster.
In relation to what Adrian said, ma'am, I think they did not exercise due diligence that is required by the situation because the law requires due diligence. And precisely the way they handle the matter when they required engineers to do this and that, push them to the limit. That is not an exercise of the proper diligence required for that kind of enterprise, that kind of vessel, and uh, that kind of management. Thank you,
Okay.
ma'am.
So have you ever been in situations where you were having difficulty communicating things to higher management?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
It's a common thing.
so you can all turn on your mic so that people know. So there's been a resounding yes
Yeah.
here in the classroom. Okay. So my follow-up question is, um, were you able to resolve these communication issues with higher management ever? Carol's like, no, not really. It's the same thing with Joaquin. He's saying no, never happened. Okay, yes, AJ. I thought you wanted to say something. Sure.
Something? It depends if the management to hear you out loud and you have the opportunity or the authority. Maybe there's a manager or a director
There's a
above you.
process in
Yeah,
place.
there's a process in place, so you don't go on that behind the back. So it has to go to a process or structure itself.
Right. Okay. So how many of you have some sort of, the ones who are incredibly frustrated with their higher management, did you have any sort of process in place to get your a word across to the higher management? Okay, KB saying yes. Some of you, most of you are like, no, not really. Yes, KB.
Because in our organization, we have or we follow, we are very strict with lines and protocols of communication, especially in the government. And we are bound to follow these rules because accountability and responsibility is very much imposed, especially in the higher management. But I think actually I have experience, a lot of experience also regarding that. It's actually, it's not how do I say it? It's getting the management to listen to you, to listen to your ideas. Why do they need to spend their time with you? So what I actually did, uh, because during that time I need to escalate a report or concern about something. I redid my report instead of just making a report that that is how would I say it? Typical. I made it atypical in an unorthodox way, getting them to understand. If I was in the perspective of the management, we would like to know. So I used simple nomenclature, statistics, and everything would help them appreciate what was I communicating and aiming for about, and I finally got their approval.
Okay, so was your recommendation ultimately useful to the company?
Yes.
Okay, so in the cases where you all have felt frustrated, did you also feel like the management's inability to listen to you was impacting the company negatively? Yes. Why?
Because Prof, it's because it's different, right? So if you will know the dynamics if the leadership is willing to listen to you and will be able to make that change. And if, for example, you have a blind spot and they have this bigger view, then so be it. I just document and then be it on file. This is the pros and cons. And then if you decide on it, then so be it. And what I wanted to explain are like clients. I mean, in our world, it's not life and death. It's right or wrong financials. You know, it's not gonna cause deaths and all that. But what I usually do for clients who wouldn't want to agree with certain recommendations, I would ask for a board resolution to support. I mean, I guess my point is, I told you, and then it will help you. But if you still would stick to something, whatever reason you have, my pros and cons and the impact on the organization is documented.
Yes, Senate.
I agree with what G just said. Most of the time when the top management does not listen, it's because they don't want to. And it's the difficulty in escalating things. It's actually a strategy of the top management to not be accountable or to have an excuse not to go through with the recommendation of the staff. So when we encounter the same problem, sadly, I'm part of the top management, but I also promote accountability. So what we did was to have a base camp. It's an application online wherein you can submit everything and they will be monitored real time. So once it's submitted and everyone can see it, there's already someone who's accountable. So I feel that that's the one that is lacking in most of the organizations. It's actually tapping that technology wherein you can monitor real time, you can change everything real time, and you can see what's really happening in the organization.
Okay, so you're saying it's an operational choice not to listen to people at the bottom of the company.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, most of the time, Prof, that's how it is.
Yes,
Yes, ma'am. I remember long ago about what I learned about efficiency and democracy. As you have mentioned earlier, the managers were obsessed with efficiency. So, although, of course, there will be in every, no, nothing is perfect. So, what they have neglected is the voice of the majority, maybe in the sense the lowly employees. So they did not have the chance to democracy is slow,
Mhm.
efficiency is quick.
okay.
That's why most managers, not all, are obsessed with efficiency. They think that listening to the lowly employees is a waste of time, and sometimes it is, because if you listen to all of them, you will sacrifice efficiency. But also, there is a relationship between efficiency and danger also.
Okay, that's a really good point. Have you ever seen instances where the organization was trying to be more efficient, but actually things became, was trying to put in smart procedures in place, so-called smart procedures, but actually ended up being even more inefficient? Yes? Okay. Um, Carol.
Because I've seen that in my current company, because we are dealing with data of clients. So as a bank, we have to process informations and we have to create a efficient way to be able to be in compliance with ECB. So in that way, sometimes the process of creating a new program is inefficient rather than using the current program in possession just because it's created by another team and you wanted to create a new one just because the other team created that and you think it's not efficient and you think and the team thinks that the codes that you're going to create for that process is more efficient. However, you created another timeline or sprint for that to be created again. So that's, I think, it's not really efficient for us. We already have a program where you're going to use another program.
So for those working in government, have you ever seen similar things happening at the government level? Dodi saying yes.
Uh, we have what you call turfing. Turfing. If you do something that will undermine my turf, then I will not listen to that. Even if it's a better idea. I'm not sure in the private sector if it's like that, but they want to have their own imprint, regardless of the efficiency or the level of effectiveness and efficiency of the model that they are using.
So-
Just because it belongs to
So
the
Zenit, have you seen turfing in your industry?
Well, yeah, but it's more of in my experience, in my previous organization, for example, the ultimate goal was to have more partners. So they always rush the signing of the memorandum of agreement or memorandum of understanding. And sometimes they would bypass the legal division because legal division takes a lot of time in reviewing contracts and memoranda. So there's this one or two instances wherein they bypass the legal division in the name of efficiency, and then the other partner, which is also a government agency, returned the MOA to my previous agency and said that they needed to review it. So instead of being actually efficient, we had to do everything all over again and follow the correct procedure. So sometimes the leaders, I'm not part of it, but sometimes the leaders would just prioritize what they want, and the way they most of the time though this correct, it's more of delivering now without actually thinking if it's an efficient use of everyone's time and energy.
Right. So there's a book. What if I told you that this problem, where you have this complex relationship between efficiency and processes and democracy, as Dodi pointed out, is something that is ubiquitous amongst developing countries.
Ma- sorry for the interruption, but you said developing countries. And so therefore you're implying that in advanced countries, that is not an issue. But so,
It is an issue, but not to the same extent. I mean,
the
right
same-
now, as we speak, the US empire is ending, right?
yes.
Right? So we're seeing what happens when there is a communication breakdown between ordinary citizens and government, and you have corporations taking over, and like corporate leaders taking over governments who are unwilling to listen to the buzz at the bottom in their own country, right? And so even though you have popular vote, the person who's at the top of the country doesn't really understand what the problems of the common person are, and doesn't want to listen either, right? So we have people at the top right now in the United States who are possibly involved in insider trading. We know that they are Tesla or Elon Musk in this particular case is using his position at Doge to have access to people's private data. He's also involved in data breaches of government agencies or of even private institutions, right? Of news networks, for example. And so you are seeing a communications breakdown. So I mean, if you want to, we always talk about, how do you build processes that are, efficient, help the organization. But if you want to see how processes break down, I would say that the US under Trump is a classic example of, how do you destroy systems, right? And if you think that those systems are, if you would like to think that your systems are really strong, no, democracy can be really fragile. Government, in some cases, can be incredibly fragile, right? So it has to be rigorously defended. If you believe in democracy, that is. Right? There are some people who might say, actually, democracy doesn't really work. And I've seen this. I mean, I don't know if the people from China would agree or disagree with this, but when I first went to Uzbekistan, it's a post-Soviet nation. And I was like, wait a second, it's really safe. It's super clean. Everybody gets a house. And if I got sick, the government doctor would just come to my house at any time of the day. I would get a free checkup, and everybody, there's a 100% literacy rate because everybody's getting free education regardless of where they are in the country. And, I was like, so wait, I come from a democratic country. Why don't we have this in place, right? This is the ideal for a democracy. Does that mean that communism is better? And so I was just like, I had like a sort of reshift as to what I thought government should be about. Because where I come from, we have these news channels which have these discussions that are really heated, and they seem like reality TV shows between, politicians And I'm sure people from the Philippines can, relate to this. And then I'm in Uzbekistan, and hey, there's no sensational news, but funnily enough, their government agencies do have a sense of humor. And so I was teaching competition law, and I opened their anti-monopoly committee's website. And funnily enough, they had Nicolas Cage memes over there. I'd never seen this on a government website, so the Uzbeks have a sense of humor. But what I'm trying to get at is that I had Brazilian colleagues over there who invited me for dinner. They were a husband and wife who were teaching at the university. And strangely enough, they started talking about the same thing. They were like, you know what? Brazil is a democracy, but it's a mess, right? And we would rather just stay here. So, but anyway, let's get back to this. It doesn't mean that democracy doesn't have its benefits, right? There are ways to do this. Like, for example, in the Pakistani context, I would say that people should have a voice, but the problem in Pakistan is that our local government isn't that strong. And so we have the members of the provincial assembly who have more power than they should because they don't want to devolve their power at the local level. And so there's also an organizational choice, right? They actually don't care about what's happening at the local level. They would rather just keep the power to themselves. And that's a choice that they've made. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is that there is a book called The Intelligence Trap. And it's actually by a scientific reporter. I think his name is David Robson. And I highly recommend that you read it if you ever come across it. And its second title is, so the book is called The Intelligence Trap: Why Smart People Do Stupid Things, right? And one of the things he says is that there are certain types of stupid things that smart people are more likely to do than actual stupid people. And why could you be simultaneously smart and stupid? How could you? Yes, Judy.
I think if you're not in touch with different realities, even if you're highly intelligent, you could do stupid things. You could end up doing
Okay.
stupid things.
How can you not be? So say, you are a really smart person. How can you not, because you're so smart, shouldn't you be more aware?
I think it's more on the inherent greed and
Inherent
crave for
greed?
power for the
Okay, what if I was to tell you that it was more about overconfidence? You've done this thing 1,000 times, and here's a new kid on the block, and he's telling you you're doing, he's not too sure about your processes. How dare he tell you to do this, right? So sometimes you'll have experts in the field who actually have more blind spots than novices, because novices are still trying to learn, right? And so they're like, slowly building up their confidence, trying to understand how systems work. And so they're more likely to get into the nitty-gritties of things as compared to experts, right? And so sometimes you'll even have, there was one case that I was reading about, also I think it's mentioned in the book, is you have like these murder cases going on in Spain. I think it was in Spain. And they try to understand, like all the evidence is pointing to one old lady. And, it doesn't make any sense. She's not even close to the murder scene. And the DNA evidence, the forensics, they're all pointing out to her. Turns out that this lady worked in the cotton bud manufacturing industry, and she was involved. She was the lady who was putting the cotton buds on top of the Q-tips that, the cotton on top of the Q-tips that they were using for DNA forensics. right? So what I'm trying to get at here is that even if you know the process, don't think that you are above making a mistake. Now, let's get back to international business law, right? It's all tied in, and we'll get to it, right? So we're going to talk about, we've already discussed how, compliance and operational excellence can be tied together. But then if you're a company and you are trying to be sustainable, what are some of the top legal and operational risks, especially because we're covering an energy company today, right? If you're an energy company, what would be the top risks that would stop you from attaining your sustainability goals?
Since I'm the one from the energy company, I think I
Right.
should be the first one to ask.
Of course.
Well, we do have safety protocols. We have goal zero actually. So safety and people always the top priority. We have goal zero incidents, and that's counted actually the man hours that's counted across the globe. That's one example.
Okay, so safety is one of them.
Safety, yes.
Okay. Zenith, I saw you raising your hand.
Yeah. The direct challenge would be the violation of current regulatory laws or rules and regulations.
Okay, safety, regulation. Anybody else who wants to take a jab at this? Yes, AJ.
For me, on the power generation side, I would like to share to the team the top operational risk for energy companies in pursuing sustainable goals. Usually, they have plant expansions. Once the plant one is shut down, the plant two will be operational to have the sustainability to supply to the community. So these are the goals that I
Right.
share.
So once plant one is shut down, do you have any like dispose it, like, how do you dispose of the whatever is happening at plant one? Do you have risks involving shutting down a program, like a facility? Are there continuing risks with having some sort of building or equipment in place?
Yeah, actually, the risk there is once the plant shutdown is have proceeded, the expansion is just auxiliary support to the plant shutdown. So the shutdown has a tenure that has to sometimes it has to do 30 days, 60 days, 24/7 shutdown of works, replacement of 7 to 7 bulbs, something like that, or spare parts or instrumentation. So it has to go back to its operation after 30 days, something like that. So that's the operational goal or challenges that the risk has to be undertaken. That's all for.
Okay. Would you say that it falls into any of these?
Yeah, precisely sitting on the stakeholder expectation and reputation of management to the organization itself internally and also to the community externally.
And how exactly would you say that it ties into stakeholder expectations?
First, the stakeholders here in the Philippines it's a wide broad because there are a lot of stakeholders involved externally, internally. May I mention one of the stakeholders for power generation is the NGCP, the Grid Corporation, Napocor, and so on and so forth. And reputations goes against to each power generation entity here who's supplying to the community. Environmental impact, yes, the shutdown the waste should be appropriately. Degassing tank, cleaning it up, you don't throw your waste just in, something. You have to have a process that complies with the environmental compliance. And that's it.
So there should be accurate disposal procedures in place. Yes, Mir, I see you raising your hand.
Thank you, Professor. I think for energy companies, specifically those who entirely depend on fossil fuels, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know fossil fuels can really take time to replenish. So there's the risk of running out of resources. That's one. And another risk would be because of the global effort to explore renewable energy. So we won't have to highly depend on it. There might come a time that fossil fuel energy dependent companies might be rendered obsolete. So I think those are the two things that I'm seeing if I'm an energy company against my sustainability goals.
Yeah. So Prof, this is an indirect knowledge. But my understanding, my husband works at Meralco, and it is related to SLA on power interruptions. So they need to really make sure that the power they're getting power from the power plant, and it has to be sustainable as it is, and any interruption has to have just certain time and SLA and impact to stakeholders, otherwise they'll be coming to penalties or other worse operational risks.
Of course. Now, getting into the nitty-gritties and getting our hands dirty with international business law, right? There are environmental compliance frameworks that are in place at the international level. The first is the UN Global Compact, and then there is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Both of them are voluntary initiatives. They're not binding, but they provide guidelines for multinational enterprises to follow, right? So the UN Global Compact, it was launched in 2000, in the year 2000, and it promotes responsible business practices in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Even though it's not legally binding, the signatories are required to issue an annual communication on progress, or a COP. And this is a public disclosure that the company makes to its stakeholders on the progress that it has made in implementing the 10 principles that it has committed itself to, right? And if a company fails to issue a COP, this can result in the signatory status being changed to non-communicating, and can eventually lead to expulsion from the compact, right? So it's not, even though it's not mandatory, it's something that companies will want to sign up to because they want to look good to their stakeholders, right? Yes, Judy.
Ma'am, question. If it's been a long while since the issues have affected environment and also people, right, and politics, right? How come the international frameworks remain to be non-binding?
It's a good question. So just because you have some frameworks that are non-binding, it doesn't mean that you do not have more compliance. And in one of the future sessions, we'll actually talk about it in the second session, the development of international environmental law. We'll also talk about how international trade laws can make companies or even states compliant. But there are cases where increasingly boards are being held liable for their failure to comply, especially with multinational corporations. I mentioned a case last week as well for an energy company, right? So Shell has been under a lot of scrutiny, for example, in the first in Dutch courts and increasingly in the UK courts, right? And so you're finding that just because it doesn't seem like things are coordinating, people are coordinating, and there are actually a lot of there are arguments even made against the international investment regime. So typically, you know that there's supposed to be investor protection, right, for companies that are operating, multinational companies that are operating overseas, right? But what you'll see increasingly is that a lot of times these companies would be involved in a lot of unsustainable, unethical practices. And if the local governments, if this whole state nation tried to say anything about it, they would say, well, we had a contract with you, and you, by stopping us from, working, you're actually violating that contract. And mostly these multinational companies would come from developed countries with a lot of power, and a lot of money. And so what's increasingly happening, even at the international level, is that the developing countries or the affected, the host nations, are now fighting back. They're saying that actually, yes, we do have a contract with you, but that does not entitle you to pollute the Amazon in South America, or pollute our airs, or go around engaging in unethical practices. And there are actually international tribunals that have upheld these arguments. This was not the case in the 1990s, certainly not the case in the early 2000s, right? But there is an increasing recognition at the international law level that there should be something, right? And there is something. So, I mean, these are just things that companies would want to voluntarily be a part of, right? So I hope that answers your question, Judy.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Ma'am,
Yes.
Madam Professor,
Yes.
I just would like to ask about the entities that have personality in international law, because traditionally these are states only.
Yes.
Are you saying, ma'am, now that, or maybe I'm not just aware, that even multinational companies have personality now?
Yes, increasingly so. And we'll see this with the Royal Dutch Shell case. This has been, actually, this is what my area of research has been: fictitious entities and how they end up getting more power than actual living people, right? But yes, in short, there was always this debate, like it's been going on for around 30 to 40 years. Why is it only states that are considered actors in public international law? And increasingly, the answer is no, they're not the only public actors. Multinational companies are now being recognized. And the Royal Dutch Shell case, which we'll study later, is a perfect example of this. Now, anyway, getting back to this. So we have the OECD guidelines, which provide a comprehensive framework for responsible business conduct. These guidelines were established in 1976, and they have also been revised several times. They're also non-binding, but the OECD has established national contact points in each country, which is a signatory to these to the OECD, to promote and support the implementation of these guidelines. And these guidelines include recommendations on due diligence processes, respect for human rights, environmental sustainability, and the promotion of sustainable consumption. And I think, I'm not sure if the Philippines has an NPC, but I do think it does. Okay. Now, there are also legal frameworks that are very industry specific. In this case, because we're covering Suncor and it's an energy company, and it's like there's extraction going on. We have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and then, which is, by the way, this exists in the Philippines, so you can actually check this out. This is, I've actually taken this from the government website. And then you also have the International Council on Mining and Metals Principles. So it has 10 principles, including ethical and sound governance, sustainable development in decision-making, respect for human rights, effective risk management, health and safety performance, social contribution, conservation of biodiversity, and land use and planning, amongst others, right? These are just very specific, industry-specific things, but there are other industries which have similar principles, like such as the steel industry is known for its negative impact on the environment, but they're increasingly becoming more aware of these, and they have their own principles in place. Okay, so a company is non-compliant. How do you make environmental rules stick? Well, you have regulatory fines and penalties. You can also revoke a company's license to operate. There will obviously be reputational impacts, especially if the government agency decides to publish your name in the national newspaper and says you've been a bad guy, right? And then you can also have civil liability where civil actors go out after you. And then in some cases, the board might get criminally prosecuted for engaging in unethical activities, especially if people die, right? Or there's bribery or fraud or, like a safety issue involved in this. Okay, so let's get to our case, which is Suncor Energy. Still one of the largest Canadian companies out there, still a big deal. During the break, I was talking about how they've still been in the news for other things. So one of the major data breaches that has happened, cybersecurity incidents that has happened in the last 3 or 4 years involved Suncor. Why? Because there were some hackers. Okay, there were some international hackers. Now, I'm not sure because we have Chinese students. I apologize. I think that there might have been like some Chinese hackers involved in this, and this doesn't mean that there usually it's either the West will normally blame either Chinese or Russian hackers, but that doesn't mean that America is not involved in cybercrime itself. Just 2 days ago, the Kremlin's cybersecurity was breached by the anonymous ransomware group. So we have this, but Suncor has been in the news lately as well. Okay, so founded in 1953, headquartered in Calgary, Canada's largest integrated energy company, and its operations include oil sands development, conventional oil production, petroleum refining, and retail operations, and pioneers in oil sands development, which, by the way, is a very controversial topic in Canada. Any guesses as to why? Yes, Andre.
Just a wild guess. Oh no, I don't have a wild guess.
You can try the wild guess. Just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
Well, I've been watching news about the government's plan to look for another country to sell their oil. So they built this infrastructure, the oil pipelines, and also maybe that's why it's a big issue there in Canada.
Yes, but why is building an oil pipeline such a controversial issue? Isn't it supposed to be a good thing? People get energy.
What was that I watched?
KB.
Maybe, Prof, it's because of the toxic gas brought about by the oil, the harvesting of the oil in the plant.
Okay, that is just one of the problems. There's also the fact that Canada is, unfortunately, even though I'm a Canadian citizen, is a settler colonial state. And what that means is that you've had primarily European settlers, right? Who came to that land, decided to kill the native population, and suppress them and take over their land, right? And this, by the way, was an issue that was ongoing when I was there in Canada myself. And so just a little bit of context. I was born Canadian, uh, to, but that's because I had a, like, I wasn't actually born in Canada. I was born to a Canadian parent outside Canada. My dad moved to Pakistan before I was born, but all of his siblings are still based in Canada. My cousins are very much Canadian. But what I'm trying to get at is that I first went to Canada as a student for my graduate education at the University of Toronto. And what stuck me was that if you went to the underground, like the metros, you would also always see on the television screens information about, you know, protests about missing First Nations women. And it would just surprise me because, you know, it's like, what is this on about? You know, especially if you're technically, even though I have the passport, but I was a foreigner, right? And so I was surprised as to what was going on. And it's because even right now, as we speak, unfortunately, First Nations are subject to abuse. And unfortunately, the church was involved in a lot of the abuse. So just 2 years ago, there were mass graves of hundreds and thousands of First Nations children that were recovered from school grounds that were run by the Catholic Church, unfortunately, that their families never knew about. They just thought that their children had run away. It was turned out that they were being slaughtered, and their parents never found out about this. So it's a really dark chapter in Canadian history. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that a lot of these pipelines run over what are First Nations lands. And so there is a lot of tension between the local communities that are First Nations that, you know, there are laws in place in Canada which tell them that, okay, this land is yours, but you always have corporate interests taking over, you know, trying to take over the interests of the native people. And obviously, there are other community residents as well who get affected because the quality of the land gets affected with these procedures, right? Okay, so I didn't want to depress you, but I can see that this is a case. But you know, if it's any consolation, the late Pope who just passed away was really a beacon for human rights. And even though I'm a Muslim, I'm a Pakistani, he was really well loved. And especially that's because despite the history of the Catholic Church, he did stand up for the Palestinians, for the Gazans. He was in contact with the churches in Palestine, and he talked about this during his last speech on Easter, right? So it just because there were institutional problems, it doesn't mean that they're remaining, but you know, it is what it is. Like I am personally sad so even though I'm a Muslim, it was also a loss for humanity, Pope Francis passing away. But anyway, so what is happening at the Firebag oil sands facility? Does anyone want to chip in? Yes, Jody and then Andre.
I will yield to the gentleman.
Okay, so where shall I start? Oh, okay. I'll start with what the Mike McSween. Oh, did I say it right?
It is Mike,
Mike.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll start there. So when he was about to take over the facility, or yeah, he discovered several issues, key challenges that he found out to be or needs resolving. So that is in relation to his vision of what Suncor should become or should, in the future.
Okay, what were those challenges?
Okay, so those challenges were basically rooted in the non-compliance of environmental laws or
Mhm.
regulations brought about by imposed by the state or the province. So, and out of that, and because of that okay, that non-compliance rooted from the beginning of, in fact, the conceptualization, the design of the facility, because the case mentioned that uh, there was this infrastructure that was included in the initial design. However, the designers of another facility deemed it unnecessary because that facility did not impose or did not have any sulfur dioxide gas emissions that would have necessitated the inclusion of that infrastructure. So they decided not to build it or put it in the firebag facility anyway. Now, however, this was not communicated with the application team while they're applying for their licenses.
Mhm.
So, and the team that were applying for the licenses submitted everything that was initially planned, but not the amended or the final design of the facility. And so upon inspection, there was this new inspector or manager.
Mike?
Oh no, from the regulatory body that came after the facility has been built and found out or discovered that there is this missing infrastructure. And then after that, they conducted an investigation and then saw more problems like, not just the levels of sulfur dioxide are exceeding beyond limit. And so so a lot of problems actually arose from that. So, and Mike found out more even further that there is a manpower problem. The employees, the existing employees, in essence, do not match their position or does not care. They're nonchalant about what's happening. Their perception of the limits of the leak was an overkill. So there was this matching issue or awareness on the effects, environmental effects. So, okay, guys, who want to help me?
He's overdone with his quota. One of the reasons
Okay.
I'm not speaking is because I've been speaking since early morning.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so
but I mean, Giselle, if you want to take over, Andre has already communicated during the
He
break that
barely
he doesn't
speaks,
he doesn't
so
feel
let him.
comfortable.
no,
But
it's
anyway,
okay.
I think he's done a pretty good job, right?
Oh.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video of the ConocoPhillips Sermont facility to show you how these processes work. So I hope that I can share the sound here. Just a moment. I'm gonna try. No, just a moment. It didn't even give me the option of sharing sound. I'm gonna stop share. Oh, there it is.
Northern Alberta is believed to contain more recoverable oil than the total reserves of Saudi Arabia. It exists in oil sands deposits, 20% of which can be mined and 80% that are too deep for mining. The deep deposits are produced by flooding the oil sands with steam.
Did you see a sample of the bitumen, the raw bitumen in that jar? And
Getting it off my hand.
yeah.
API sponsored a tour for bloggers and reporters recently at ConocoPhillips' Surmont location, where steam-assisted gravity drainage, or SAGD, is used to produce about 20,000 barrels of oil per day.
There are 10 well pairs, meaning a steamer and a producer, down along that run of piping.
There's a producer that brings the bitumen out of the ground, and there's an injector that takes the steam from the CPF and puts it into the ground. The vertical well is about 1,000 feet down, and it kicks off about 3,000 feet. The steam's necessary because the consistency or the viscosity of the fluid is like a hockey puck. It's solid, so you need to bring that temperature up so it flows to surface.
After steam is injected into the wells, the oil can be pumped to the surface. Sometimes natural gas is injected to improve the flow. Then, when the oil is out of the ground, the water and the gas are removed and the oil is diluted. Then the water is treated and recycled. About 90% of it is reused for steam.
So it's one great big circulating loop. And the biggest part of the process and facility, we're just a big thermal plant, so we've got so much heat. We do a lot of heat recovery into the processes, into the vessels, so it's very tightly connected on everything we do. You need one part to do the other part, one big circle, one big daisy chain.
Surmont has a smaller environmental footprint than mining. The facilities are built for easy removal, and they're placed on a thick layer of gravel that can be removed and reused. Even the housing for the workers is portable, allowing for the entire area to be replanted with native grasses and trees. Alberta's oil sands account for less than 0.1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and they supply almost 2% of the world's oil. Having this resource on America's doorstep helps U.S. energy security. This is Jane Van Ryan for Energy Tomorrow.
Okay, what do you guys think? Has it changed your perspectives? Or do you have more questions now than answers?
Canada is one of the richest country. I think that would be the result, and my conclusion, because it mentioned Saudi Arabia, which is one of the richest also in terms of oil. So that's my comment, Pop.
Yeah, Canada has rich resources. Do you think the information that they're providing is accurate about the environment? Andre's like, no.
Well, no, because I'm not a good numbers guy, but I mean mathematician, but they're producing a lot but emitting so little. It's either they're very good at reducing that waste, or it's not being reported, or the numbers are manipulated, or something like that. At least that's just my hunch. If they're that rich. Because in Saudi, I'm aware that they're producing a lot of, what do you call that? Wastes. But the opening statement mentioned that Canada has more than Saudi. So anyway, that's just my
So you're not really sure if they're that compliant, basically.
well, part of the case mentioned that we're dealing with the bigger things here. That kind of statement gives me the idea that maybe yes, they're not really accurately reporting whatever they have to report.
Okay. Yes, Judy, and then KB.
I like that they ended the video with mentioning energy security, but I didn't hear anything about renewables or shifting the energy mix So if I only hear about, richness and being richer than Saudi in terms of resources, and if it comes across that what they mean by circular is ensuring energy security using that same cycle, it worries me that there's probably no shift to renewables because I didn't hear anything about changing the energy mix. I just heard about energy security.
Okay. So we know at the time that this case is taking place, there are issues at the company, right? And who is Mike McSween in this equation?
At the time of the case, he was the incoming vice president.
Okay, he was the incoming vice president. Did he have any plans for the company?
Yes, to increase the number of oil production per day, barrel production per day.
Okay. So he's really, he wants a resilient company. And I'm actually going to show you a video of an interview with Mike McSween, which is about delivering on operational excellence. Okay, I think I shared the wrong screen. It sometimes happens, I don't know, with Zoom. It seems like you're sharing the right screen and it turns out, nope. It's like a decoy or something. Okay, here it is.
So it's interesting. I mean, it's one of these discussion points we've had for many, many years. And I think even within Suncor, it's been a challenge to define it in a way that is meaningful for everyone. For some people and some organizations, it means low cost. And that's actually not what we want within our company. We talk about 4 key pillars. One is around safety, and that includes process safety management. So managing the safety of the people, but as well the integrity of the facilities that we operate. Second is around sustainability, which is also a core value in our company, but it's all about consistent improvement in each and every day in what we operate. And then reliability is the other piece. And when we have reliability, we have actually good process safety, we have good personal safety, and we have better environmental performance as well. So, it's not a mutually exclusive kind of thing. They actually all intersect and actually help each other. And then the fourth is around people and developing people's capacity and their ability to contribute and engagement. And so again, all of those things actually reinforce each other. They all are necessary. And you very rarely will have a facility that has really poor safety that operates well. I mean, those things just aren't congruent.
What do you think? How is it seeing Mike McSween?
Mike is saying the right things.
Mhm.
It seems.
But
Yeah, but I would just like to relate the topic earlier that communication between the upper management and the employees. So, okay, I have to process my thought first. Sorry.
Mhm. Yes, he's saying the right things, but
Okay, but it's one thing that you get an interview. I would say this as a I'm an upper management,
Mhm.
but so as much as I don't, it's an interview. I'm supposed to say
The right things.
the right things. I'm not saying we're not doing that in my company, guys. No. I always listen to my employees. So but I'm aware that it's not usually, or no, I'm sorry. It's not always like that. You say the ideal, because it has to be your reputation at stake if you're too open. So you have to say the right things.
Okay. So do we have these? Okay. So for people who are offline, you can think about this. We have these questions here, right? I want you to work together. We have only 5 minutes, but just sort of think of this as a mind map. And we can, so you can think about what the problems are at um, at Firebag, and how controllable are these problems? The problems, right? Write down the problems. Just write down what the problems are.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Are we talking about Mike on the SunScorp that we have submitted on Alice?
Yes, it's the same. It's the same ish,
Same issue.
Same issue. Yes. Okay. I want you to think about the problems, and for people who are online, you can actually just type those problems into the chat box as you think about them online out loud. Do you have? Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. So how about this? We put the people online into a separate group, and the people who are here, we can have a separate group for them, right? And just like take a quick 5 minutes before we can come together and discuss this. So online people, you can all talk to each other and just come up with a list. If maybe one of you wants to have a PowerPoint slide where you can just put the list in, and then we can talk to the rest of the class. So once you're done writing down the problems, you can come together and share with each other what you think those problems are. If you're done thinking about the problem, you can actually start sharing what you've gathered. This is fine. I can read it. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So have you come up with your list of problems? You have some sort of a broad idea? Okay. Out of all the problems, which problems would you say were operational problems? Management? Okay. Do you want to speak into the mics? You can just borrow each other's mics, by the way.
Operational. So our group, our on-site people, the on-site people,
In situ.
in situ, fornitude, did like thought the people are not, they're no experts, they're disengaged, and leadership, how do you say that? Leadership distancing. Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
I would like to share with my colleague who is from the energy industry. I think I hope my mates would agree with me here that the problem is actually there are left and right problems in an industry where I came from, in energy or power generation.
You can sit down.
Yeah, okay. There is a problem with process and non-process. So an operational for an energy facility, you have to understand the problem on the process area and the non-process. Because if these two don't sink in operationally, you cannot address issue of the environmental compliance and so on and so forth. All the problems that been listed by my mates here. But the number one core here, in order, Mike's identified all the problems already. He was talking nicely, he had a nice talk, he delivered it precisely in accordance to convince people. But if there is no buy-in from the senior leaders, from the stakeholders, everything Mike's talking, will be useless. Yeah, I understand, ma'am. I think I have mentioned on that list already. there's an operational and there's a cap between the authorities. So you cannot address those problems that we have mentioned and my teams mentioned. That's all, sorry.
Yes,
Probably,
Giselle.
Prof, their target, the main operational issue that we're seeing, which is a symptom to more issues, is that their target is way higher than the cap, the environmental cap, but the actual production is even lower than all of that. So that is the main symptom, the main operational problem. They're delivering much less than the reduced allowed because of the cap already. And yeah, it mentioned from an operational side first that there's no enough expertise in the people, disengagement, and even awareness on, like, there's a disconnect in the, I would say, middle to the low ranks.
There's a communication problem.
Yeah, and really, even to from what Mike is saying there to what's happening, there's really that big gap.
Okay, so are the people online on board with this? Do you all agree with this? You can give me a thumbs up. We've only received one thumbs up.
Only one.
Two, okay. Okay. So we know that there are also compliance challenges, right? There are issues such as, water discharge, non-compliance events. You're exceeding your regulatory limits as to what you can extract, for example, reporting delays to authorities. And then that also exposes you to potential penalties and enforcement actions, right? And so you have these different frameworks within Alberta. So this is what the stakeholder landscape looks like, right? There's a regulatory landscape, there's a community, right? Then there's a financial, and then there are others, including industry associations, the media, environmental NGOs. Now, if you were in Mike's position, what would be your action plan and why? How optimistic are you that he can turn things around? Yes, Andre.
Because the question says, if I am in Mike's position, I'm
And
very
you are in a leadership position, so you know.
I'm very optimistic, because at least from what I'm identifying, the solutions to these problems really just involves money or funding. What I mean is, for example, you have to put AI predictive monitoring devices so that you can always monitor your gas emissions. So things like that, management training, paying for the right people, all those things. In even transportation, because it says that there's an issue about its location. So, or maybe put up a housing just like what we saw in earlier in the video. So it's about finance. So you just really have to have a upper management level to agree with what you are saying, because at any rate, if you comply with all these problems, then you will be able to, then the regulatory body will lift the cap limit for the production, or at least that they could do that. And then you could even produce more. And then that's going to earn you more. So, and while complying with all the environmental safety matters. So if I'm in Mike's position, I'd be very optimistic, because it also said it's in the case that there is an increase, their profit is increasing, or at least the world market is increasing, the price is increasing. So all those, for me, taking into their consideration, of course, that is the ideal thing, pouring a lot of capitalization into that plan, so I can turn things around.
Yes, AJ. The people online can hear you, right? No, they can't. Okay. Maybe you could just speak into the mic. About Mike. I think there's a problem with the volume, maybe. I think it should work now.
It's working now?
Yes,
Okay.
and you can sit down.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to share to my mates uh, based on the document provided on this publishing document. I'm optimistic that Mike can turn things around. I have would like to share some few bullet points here. So based on the experience demonstrated by Mike, have very impressive credentials, experience, past result oriented in both business and operation. These are the characteristics that I believe to be optimistic. So the few bullet points that I would like to share to my mates here. It was identified that all the risk and statutory compliance that needs to be addressed, including safety. He was able to identify and improve process on change management and implementation of safety compliance, which is part of the composition of his action plan. He also noticed that he's willing to address welfare of the talents to avoid exhausted 2 hours travel time to work, vice versa. So tough to be exhausted on this travel time. And he plans to support and provide competitive remuneration of talents of roster or workforce. Also including addressing those issues in compliance, specifically on the S2S emissions and other hazard identified on the process area. He also can implement safety for people-based safety to align with all parties for non-process. Because if non-process cannot be corrected, the operational process will not be also effective. So also to implement on firebag management and operations to standardize the policy so that non-operations have buy-in. And the last one, Prof, is a regular counter-checking or countermeasures to issue on a daily basis on a safety compliance checklist. That's all for me.
And that is how an industry expert talks, right? Yeah. He knows what he's talking about. Thank you so much for that insight. Okay, so we're running out of time, but if I'd had time, what I would have done is this. So this is Dr. Stephanie Burdell's Wheel of Sustainability, embedding sustainability culture wheel, right? So you'll see that it has, broadly speaking, 4 main quadrants. So, you know, how do you embed sustainability into your company's culture, right? You look at both your formal and your informal processes, and you also look at what it is that you're currently delivering or want to deliver, and then what it is that you want to advance in the company, right? And then you can see within the wheel, there are all these different things that overlap between all these different goals, right? And your processes, right? So if we had time, I would have asked you that, you know, all your solutions that you've come up with for Suncor, where would you have placed them in the embedding sustainability cultural wheel? So if you want, you can still work around this during the break, talk to each other about it. And then even though the next topic is completely different because we're going to delve into the history of international environmental law, you can still think about how this wheel could be beneficial to you in your organization. Okay, so see you at 3:30. You can take screenshots if you're really interested. It will be uploaded. I'm sorry I haven't uploaded the slides yet. I will eventually do it, but if you're really passionate about it, you can just take a picture of this and work around it. I'm happy to hear that. Do we have other people joining us offline?
Prof, in the Google sample, the wheel,
Mhm.
the matrix on the left is called fulfillment. The matrix on the right is called innovation. It's the same, right? Deliver and deliver and advance.
I can see you're really excited about that wheel.
I am. I'm gonna print this out.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know if it's worth waiting for the students, but I'm going to start. Have you ever had problems with your neighbors? Okay. What type of problems have you had with your neighbors? You don't have to go into the details, but just tell us the general nature of the problems you've had with your neighbors. Yes, Zenit.
In the morning, their phone always alarms. And even when I'm on my way to the office, I can still hear it from the elevator.
Okay. Yes, Judy.
I was gonna say noise related.
Noise related
Similar.
problems.
Yeah.
Okay. So noise related problems. Any other problems you've had with your neighbors? Yes, KB.
In the province, our subdivision is adjacent also to another community where they raise pigs in their backyard. So the smell, yeah,
Okay.
it goes to us.
Okay. So some of you have problems with sounds when it comes to their neighbors. Some of you have problems with smells. Any other type of problem you've ever had with your neighbors? Right away. Okay. Yes, Andre.
Oh, my neighbor upstairs in my condo had burst pipe in their bathroom, which seeped through my ceiling. So I had water leaking down my ceiling.
So there was a hazard problem.
Yes.
Okay. So there was a dangerous thing that escaped from the neighbor's premise and moved on to yours.
Yes.
Right. In this case, it was water.
Yep.
Okay. So Andre, you also happen to be a lawyer.
Yes.
And as a lawyer, how would you have dealt with this problem with your neighbor?
I would have sent a demand, or I would have called their attention. Then I would have sent a demand to that a letter. Oh, okay. First, I would let them know that the damage to their unit is affecting my unit. I'm going to enumerate the damages that has been done to me. And then I'm going to either make them pay for it or give them an option that I'm going to fix their water proofing, and then they're just going to have to pay pay me for it. So I'm going to give them options to do that.
So would you say that your neighbor has criminal intent?
No.
That's the short answer.
Based on the facts, it
Based-
was an accident. So I would not have guessed that there is criminal intent unless they intentionally burst their pipe. So
Right. So why am I asking you about your neighbors? The thing is that international environmental law is really just about a dispute with your neighbors. And in this case, you have two actors, right? And they're neighbors. And so we were talking about how in international law there are only really two, only the only legal persons in public international law are states, right? And so if you have one actor that is being noisy, smelly, is releasing harmful objects, the other one is getting disturbed, right? And there is there's a type of law that normally deals with neighbors? And sorry,
You have that in the States, I mean, neighbor law.
neighbor law. I thought it was
I have a book on that.
you have a book on neighbor laws. Really? You actually have a book on neighbor laws?
America. Neighbor law. Neighbor, not labor.
Neighbor laws,
Neighbor
really?
laws. Yes, ma'am.
So you wrote it?
Please, sorry,
Okay.
I did not author it.
No.
I have a copy of somebody had authored it.
Somebody else wrote a
My-
book on neighbor
My book
laws,
is on legislation. Po. The one I wrote is on legislation,
on legislation.
on impeachment,
Okay,
and gun law.
okay. But that is not neighbor law, unless your neighbor
Correct.
shoots you with a gun.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so there is actually a type of law called tort law. I know the lawyers ever heard about it. They're all nodding their heads. What about the non-lawyers? Have you ever heard about tort law? No. Okay. So depending on which language you're using, it, tort could mean different things. So in Russian, tort means cake. And and I know I'm going to go over time because I always do this, but whenever I get stuck at Dubai airport has happened a few times. I feel like I'm in some sort of limbo as a multilingual person, and depending on how I'm dressed, if I'm dressed like in black clothes, people will like. I've had multiple incidents of people thinking I'm Egyptian. I'm not. I'm just I'd say I have a international brown face. Where like depending on how I'm dressed, people will assume I'm from their nationality or something else. But why I'm mentioning this is that I was stuck at Dubai airport once during COVID because my flight got canceled and it was whatever. But there was a Russian lady who was at a bakery at the airport at a cafe, and the vendor happened to be Filipino, right? And this Russian lady does not speak a word of English and is, mumbling in Russian about how much she hates this guy. And the poor guy is just trying to do his job and is just like, "Bam, do you want cake?" And I had to intervene and I had to say, "Tort, da," like da is yes. And all of a sudden she has like a light bulb moment and she's like, "Da, da, da." So anyway, that's the story about torts and cake. And she was like then saying thank you to me in Russian, which is spasiba. But that is like, that just shows I know enough Russian to save the poor worker at the state. But anyway, tort in our context means something twisted. It means this applies to types of wrongs that are not really contractual, but are also not criminal, right? And so in some cases, you can have tort law going to like criminal courts, like if there's a defamation case, but you can also have civil liability, depending on how things go, right? So these are like twisted cases that don't really belong into the either criminal law or contractual civil law side of things, right? So they can go, depending on the jurisdiction, can go either way. And international law, international environmental law, is based on traditional tort law, right? It's based on your disputes between neighbors, because like you have a right to your property, right? Your neighbor also has a right to use their property. And there is a type of tort law which is related to nuisance, right? So you can have either public or private nuisances. Would the lawyers in the room like to explain to the non-lawyers what is the difference between public and private nuisance? And Andre is just like dreading this answer, and so which is why I'm actually going to ask him.
I forgot. Can you?
Okay,
Save
we'll,
me.
we'll ask the constitutional expert then.
What would you have is nuisance per accidents and nuisance per se.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if that is
So road accidents are nuisance per se. Is that how I heard it?
no, ma'am. I think I said what we've studied is nuisance per se and nuisance per accidents, but I'm not sure if they can be if they correspond to the public-private nuisance.
Okay, yes, Senate.
So, public nuisance law is concerned more of the effect on the public. For example, related to environment, health hazards, for example, and private nuisance law is concerned on the exercise of a private property which affects private parties.
Other private individuals,
Yeah.
right? So a good example of this would be um somebody digging a well in the road without having proper authority to do this, without having, without any putting any tape or any boundaries around this, right? So that is something that would affect the public at large, right? And so that is a public nuisance. Okay. A private nuisance is where both parties have some sort of entitlement to their land, but one of them is acting in a way which is harming the other party's private enjoyment of their land in a way that would be ideal. Right. So maybe your neighbor is blocking access to your light, is smelly, is noisy, so on and so forth. And that is the type of law that comes to the international level and becomes international environmental law. And so as we go forward, we will delve into these these disputes between neighbors where states are behaving badly. Yes, Andre.
I think it's a bad joke that I said I forgot. I guess I just got nervous. That's it.
Do you have examples?
Of the, I'll be serious. Of the, what was that? Oh, in a case?
Mhm.
Okay, a case where a landowner has dig a very deep well, a large well, but that landowner left it without any fences or any obstruction where um and then a kid from a nearby house, or they played near that well, and that kid fell and died. So that's a public nuisance.
Right.
But wherein am I supposed to give a international example, Professor?
But okay, let's start with this, right?
Okay.
In terms of, that somebody did something which was harmful, right? But did they have criminal intent when they were digging this hole? Like, did they, normally what happens in criminal law is that you need to establish mens rea, right?
Yes.
Like, this act was intentional.
Yes.
Yeah, but a tort also could be done intentionally, but there is no criminal intent.
There's no criminal intent, right?
The intent is not criminal,
So-
but there is intent too.
so
Some tort.
When a person is digging a well, are they aware of the negative consequences?
But they should be, because that's a basic that's the idea of a tort, damage from tort. So
Yeah. So the test is foreseeability,
foreseeability, yeah.
right? Was the damage foreseeable?
Yes.
Even though you did not intend to kill this particular kid, but it was foreseeable that somebody could have been harmed with the way you're going about digging this well. Yes, Dodi.
What I remember is the example of the swimming pool. Remember, there's a case, and but the owner did not place fences across around the pool. So because pools are not per se nuisance, uh, but because there was no fence placed, and in fact a child was drowned in that pool, then that would be considered as a uh, nuisance, but per accidents. That's how I remember it.
Okay, so for the non-lawyers here, yes, Dodi.
Yeah. So so in tort, because there are torts that can be committed by negligence. There is lack of care. There is also tort that can be done intentionally, like battery of domestic battery is a tort before, but
Yeah,
now
so
it's
if you hit
criminal.
somebody that is, like that
Battery.
harms them, but it doesn't kill them, that is battery, right?
Yes,
It's done intentionally, but you don't intend to kill the person.
That's right.
Right?
The intent is not criminal, but there is also intent to perpetrate the particular act, but it is not defined as a criminal offense. So magkaiba. But there are also torts. I think in international law too, there are torts that are not intentional, like in transboundary harm.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. When let's say they burn and slash in one country and the smoke escapes across the border into the other country. So that is also some kind of nuisance
Which
because it
is,
affects.
how many of you read the case?
Oh,
All of you?
not me.
Just a little bit. Enough. Okay. So this was also a case, the trail smell case was a classic case of fumes, transboundary, air pollution, right? Going from, well, we think of Canada as a good guy in international law. No, it wasn't. It was actually harming the US, right? So there was a smelter in a small town in Canada called Trail that was causing harm, transboundary harm to American citizens and also to the environment in America in general, right?
I may add a little bit more. Normally, states are free to do whatever they want in their own sovereign jurisdiction. But because environmental law international has developed, now the sovereignty of states are also parang has become not really limited. There is by signing treaties, they have limited themselves by auto limitation. So they're now liable if the harm that the things that they do within their jurisdiction, which traditionally is uh, not actionable by other states. Now, because of the development of public international law on transboundary harm, they can now be made to pay for damages that was caused to the neighboring states.
Yes, and this is exactly why the US left the Paris Agreement under the first Trump era, right?
Because they were a state party to
Yes.
the Paris Agreement.
Yes, so the Paris Agreement is in the realm of public international law, right? Because it is signed by states, it's not signed by corporations, but obviously states can implement laws and regulations within their own jurisdictions to implement the Paris Agreement. But the Trump administration rolled back on a lot of environmental agreements that it had made, and a lot of environmental commitments and regulations. And surprisingly, the Obama administration did not want to go back to those agreements, right? Sorry, the Biden administration. So Obama was actually responsible for a lot of environmental regulation, especially with the BP oil spill. He did a lot for the environment. But Biden, even though he was technically seen as a successor to Obama, followed largely corporate interests. So anyway, we're going to talk about today the historical development of international environmental law. And we're going to identify key treaties and principles that affect business operations. And we'll also see if there are compliance requirements and strategic opportunities for businesses to, boost their reputation as good actors at the international, even local level. And we're going to apply our insights from this historical development to corporate environmental governance. Now, environmental law, even though the trail smelter case or the Fur Seal case, which I'm going to talk about soon, are just developments from the last 200 years, 150 years or so. Environmental law and regulations are not really new as such, right? Wherever you have society and people living together, people will want to be clean. The governments will want to regulate it, even though the state as a legal person did not exist pre-Westphalia, right? Pre the wars between Europe, right? But you did have government, and you did have government that wanted to regulate how people interacted with each other and what sort of environments markets had, for example, and how people were living, and were they impacting others just as much as you had criminal laws in place, right? So even if you go to Babylon, you'll have some sort of laws about it's bad to kill people, it's bad to steal from people. It's the same thing with environmental regulations. So you have ancient civilizations such as the Indus Valley civilization, actually one of the oldest civilizations in the world. We still don't know. I'm technically from the Indus Valley, but this civilization, the language has not been decoded fully. It's one of the few languages, but we know that this is also, by the way, where yoga came from. And they were not Hindus, as far as we know. They did not really, as far as I know, there are no like formal there was no formal religion there. It's like most likely monotheist or whatever, but very different from what India has become now. But it's actually, the Indus Valley is a part of what is Pakistan now. They had really good waste management and sanitation systems in place. It was the same thing in Rome, right? If you ever want to watch videos of Rome, if you haven't been to Italy, I would highly recommend looking at how Rome did its drainage. It's still quite spectacular. So they had legislation regarding the city's supply of clean water for drinking and bathing. It was the same thing with Middle Eastern and Central Asian cities. So the Romans had this office called the censorus. It was actually to administer public morality, but also to administer markets. And when you had the Arabs coming and taking over, they had one of the first things is that with Islam in particular, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a trader by profession. So markets are very central to morality in Islam. And one of the first things he did, the first city-state that he established was in Medina, where he is now buried. And he decides to have an office of the administrator of the market. And the first administrator that he appoints is actually a woman by the name of Samra. And this administrator of the market is also responsible, very much like the censorus, to regulate the market and also make sure that the market has a clean environment. So if you might be thinking, why would back then, when you don't have a large corporation, why would the Romans or the Persians, and by the way, Persian cities are also a really good example of how to create cities, especially when you have water scarcity. So why would you have these ancient civilizations trying to regulate clean air or clean water, right? You don't have large corporations, right? You don't have the same level of exploitation. But you do have smaller industries such as blacksmiths, tanning, right? Can these, and these industries can pollute the environments, the air, and also the water, right? So it's important to regulate these industries. And normally what happens is that these industries are told to operate outside the city in safer environments. So you have these local level environmental laws that are in place, even in ancient civilizations. So you see this, like, even going forward, we know from, if you watch enough Hollywood movies, you'll see images of London being this, during the era of Charles Dickens, being a really dirty place, not exactly the ideal that you would like to go and live in, unlike what it has become. So you have in the 14th century, England prohibiting the burning of coal in London and the disposal of waste into its waterways. You have the same thing in the US eventually, where the Quaker leader of the English colony of Pennsylvania, William Penn, orders that 1 acre of forest be preserved for every 5 acres that is cleared for settlement, right? So we have some sort of land zoning and environmental laws in place over there, right? And so we also have in the next century, Benjamin Franklin leading various initiatives and campaigns to curtail the dumping of waste. In the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution. And during this time, the British government, because there's so much smog in London, decides to pass regulations to reduce the deleterious effects of the burning of coal and chemical manufacture on public health and the environment, again, which is like very specific to the Industrial Revolution. So when we move on to the international realm, from, is eventually when we have nation states and states have legal personality, we move also onto the realm of international environmental law, right? And so with public international law, you have 2 persons, like you have the only recognized person being the states, right? And so normally in public international law, these actors will sign treaties, have some sort of customs with which they interact with each other, and they'll also have principles that govern the protection of the environmental, the environment at the international level, right? However, when these laws are first passed, they are really just there for the, because human beings realize, the more we use the environment, it's kind of bad for our business, right? So if we're overfishing, we're overusing things, eventually we won't be able to consume them or eat them, right? So it's not really because they really love the environment, it's because there's a practical need to be, more frugal. Yes, Andre, did you want to say anything? Okay.
I'm just agreeing, Professor.
You're disagreeing. Okay. So the initial approach to the international regulation of environmental problems is basically around 3 issues, right? You first come up with rules that govern the exploitation of certain resources, especially if it's transboundary use of, certain resources. And you all want to use the same thing, and I'm sure the Philippines can relate to this because you share seas with several countries like Malaysia, China, right? Indonesia also, and right? So a whole bunch of countries that you're sharing the seas with, and obviously animals move around in these seas. It's the same sea, right? You all want to have those nice crabs, lobsters, sea mantis, whatever it is, right? Some of you may want to have more of it, right? But eventually, you don't want those resources to go away completely, right? You would like to be able to eat all of this whenever you can, right? So it's in your best interests as neighboring countries to be frugal, to think about the other person, because if you're being too glutinous, you're actually going to harm yourself eventually, right? Do you agree with this? Okay, so then so you have, the rules governing the exploitation of certain resources. Then you also have transboundary damage, which is what the Trail Smelter case is about. And then you have the use of shared water courses, right? So if you're using the same water course, you might want to be a little clean about it, right? It's like if you're using the same road, you don't want to be dumping trash onto the road, right? You don't want to be like a infant who, basically poops everywhere, right? Doesn't have a diaper. I'm just saying. But that's like the closest analogy I can think of, right? So you just want to be a nice citizen of the international realm. Now, the first case that comes to mind here is actually about the rules governing the exploitation of certain resources. Sorry. So, and that is the fur seals case. So back in the 1800s, it was really fashionable to use fur seals to create fashion items. And you know how it is with fashion items, everybody wants it, right? Which also goes to show that the fashion industry has always been complicit in the wrong use of the environment. So you have you have the Bering Sea, which is between Russia, Canada, and the US, and somehow China also gets involved in this. Japan also gets involved in this. And this dispute is really about, at the time, Canada isn't really there, so it's the UK. So it's really about who has the right to hunt for fur seals in the North Pacific, right? And how does this dispute get triggered? Well, there are Canadian vessels that are hunting for fur seals in the North Pacific, and the US arrests these vessels. And the argument is that we actually need these fur seals for other things. They're crucial to our environment. They have blubber. We need these things for things that are more important than that's just fashion, and so on and so forth. And there's a tribunal that is set up in Paris, and it rules in favor of the United Kingdom, but at the same time also creates a regime to preserve the seals. The tribunal's regime fails, and there's more and more exploitation of these seals. The US goes on and captures more vessels, and the tribunal condemns the US and then assesses damages against it, and then also restricts sealing during the summer breeding months. Now, if you know anything about Canada, the summer is really the only time you can actually get things done, especially in that part of Canada where you have Alaska and all of that. So yeah. What this leads to is the North Pacific Fur Seal Convention. And which restricts further sealing in these jurisdictions. So that's really what the first one is about. It's not because they care about the fur seals, it's because all of them want it, right? And so decide, if Canada uses all these seals up, there's nothing else for us. So, we don't want Canada to eat up and, kill all our seals. The second case is about transboundary dispute. And this is with a case that I assigned you where again, Canada is acting like a bad neighbor to the US. It seems like now the US is paying Canada back. If we look at how if we look at how Trump has been behaving. But it's been like that, you know, Canadians don't like Americans. It's really funny. But they'll complain about how NAFTA is against them and so on and so forth, right? So you have Cominco, which is a mining and smelting company, which is operating in Trail in British Columbia, which is, by the way, where all the Twilight movies got shot. So it's a really beautiful place, but you know, back in the 1920s, it wasn't the most, you know, they had the Trail smelter, and people in British Columbia were actually really proud of having the smelter, right? So it's a bit different than now promoting British Columbia as, you know, the place where the Twilight movies were shot, you know, or what was that Leonardo DiCaprio movie where he got mauled by a bear? But that was also shot there. Anyway. Okay, so anyway, you have sulfur dioxide emissions between 1925 to 1937, which damaged crops, forests, and soil in Washington state, which is actually where the Twilight movie, the novels are based, right? Just next door. So, so the US seeks damages and injunctive relief from Canada. Injunctive relief basically means that you stop, you know, tell Canada to stop, right? Stop the air pollution. And there's a dispute that is sent to an international arbitration tribunal, which is the International Joint Commission, which was established by bilateral treaty between the two countries. The ITC orders Canada to pay the United States $78,000 in compensation, which is a big deal back then. Back then, it would be millions of dollars, not now how it is right now, right? And it also requires the smelter to install instruments to monitor wind direction, temperature, and sulfur dioxide concentrations. It was also required to keep sulfur dioxide emissions below a certain threshold, regardless of weather conditions. And it also establishes the polluter pays principle and the principle and concept of transboundary harm, right? That no country can allow its territory to be used in a way that causes significant harm to another country. Now, how did the tribunal go about analyzing the impact of the smelter on the environment and the community on the Northport area in Washington? This is what the map looks like. This is, you can see Trail, and you can see that is Northport is downstream from British Columbia.
I don't know why people are still tired from last night, but
Examine it. But
we had a FINMA exam last night, so we were all like, no bad. No, but so I'm wondering why only Adrian is
You know,
absent.
I just learned from you guys that going to law school in the Philippines can be a very traumatic process.
Yeah.
And I feel like you're thinking this is more like your recitals back in law school. It's not meant to be that the case.
All right. So to answer the first question, Prof, it was analyzed. I think they hired through scientists, and in terms of the damages that has been incurred by smelter to US and the surrounding environment.
Right. So how exactly did they do it? Like what were they using any measures? What was happening? Yes, Senate.
Prof, they implemented like SO2 recorders, meteorological recorders, so as to measure the SO2 there.
Yes, Andre.
To add to what Zinit said, the tribunal also analyzed the impact on the surround how do I say it? They analyzed the everything from the air direction, wind direction, how high the air goes, or how low the air goes, the effects of probable effects of the what's that smelter to the trees, and they just based it on expert witnesses and a history of actually the place.
Okay, good. Yes, KB.
They also analyzed the crop yield reductions, effects to deaths of the trees, as what Andre have said, impacts to the farming community, and also the indirect impacts to the population decline.
Yes, Senate.
So for example, so there are different types of lands that were involved in this case, and they implemented like different tests. For example, generally they didn't rule in favor of of the United States for the land, but in one part of the soil, which is near the river, they found a high level of acidity. So they took that in consideration. But generally, they implemented a clear and convincing evidence as as a standard of evidence or proof.
Okay, so what you'll notice here is that there was a lot of reliance on scientific evidence. And that is also what sets international environmental law and environmental law apart from other types of laws. It's not that you don't have scientific analysis in other types of laws, but environmental law exists primarily because scientists started to, ring alarm bells that things are wrong with the world, right? It was the same thing with the Industrial Revolution. They were saying that it's primarily scientists saying it's affecting people's breathing quality, it's affecting other things, doctors saying different things. So what you'll also see is that, especially when you read environmental judgments, you'll see a lot of science used in this, right? So just keep that in mind whenever you're dealing with environmental cases, that this is going to happen. Okay. Why was the tribunal hesitant to definitively blame the smelter for the pollution? Yes, Andre.
Because the experiments conducted back then did not have a definitive conclusion that the pollution was caused by smelter. The tribunal appreciated evidence that there are other factors, for example, a fire, a wildfire that was the cause of the deforestation or the inability of those trees to grow back again, or the quality of the soil in the first place, or bad weather. Other than the fire, there's also the not enough volume of rain per year. That's why the crops were not yielding as much. There was also basically it did not have a exact or a conclusive evidence, or at least the United States, that pointed smelter for the
Good job. Yes, Zaret.
I would have to qualify that because it would depend when it took place, because based on the decision, it was divided into three parts. So starting 1932, that was the part that the tribunal was very hesitant to just chalk it up with a smelter for the pollution. And yes, according to Andre, and to build up on Andre's answer, The tribunal also said that there are several factors, and that, for example, fires and logging, and that it's too speculative for them to just blame smelter for that. Additionally, again, I would go back to the burden of proof, which was not clearly established, which is important in international law.
Excellent. Good job. Okay. How did the decision strike a balance between holding the smelter accountable for its pollution and regulating its emissions rather than halting them altogether? Was it able to strike a balance? Yes, Zenith.
So again, based on the decision, they divided it into three parts. For the things that happened before 1932, they made smelter liable for that. Moving forward, they said that there's no enough proof. But I think for future instances, they imposed 750,000, I think $750,000, which should be paid in case there will be violation. But then again, it has to be proven for that.
Good job. Okay, so would you say that there were broader implications of this case back then on environmental regulations and corporate responsibility, even though this was a case of public international law?
Let me just say something about decisions of international tribunals. The doctrine of president does not apply.
Yeah.
Yes. But there is what they call the principle of consistency. So maybe it's they can exhort to follow, but it is not binding.
Yes, because you don't have a higher, it's not as hierarchical and
That's
like the
right.
parties are equal. So of course.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, Zenith.
I would like to build on Dodi's statement. It's also via an arbitration proceeding, which does not um give precedent. Anyway, the importance of the trail smelter case is it provided or it codified the no harm principle, which means that states, even in the exercise of their sovereignty, cannot simply produce harms to other states because of that, which effectively turned over the decision in the case of Costa Rica versus Nicaragua, which was the binding decision during that time.
Yes. But we're talking here about corporate responsibility, right? This is international business law. Yes.
Let me just hasten to add that although decisions of international tribunals and courts are not binding, they are a subsidiary means of getting at what the law is. Meaning, some of the decisions could develop into customary norms of international law or generally accepted principles of international law that bind states, not the individuals, but the states. So, yes, the doctrine of precedent does not apply, but the decisions can generate international law.
Right. So even though we know that this was a state level thing, Cominco did have to change the way that it operated the smelter, right? So there was indirect corporate liability, even though Cominco was not the actual actor in international law, right? Okay.
Just one point, ma'am.
Yes.
Sorry. Because there was a treaty between them,
Yes,
a bilateral
that is because
treaty.
there was a treaty between the US and Canada that already existed.
And
Yes.
the devil is in the
Is in
details
the
of the
details.
treaty.
If there was no treaty, what would have happened, right?
Thank you, ma'am.
They already had, this treaty already said that there's going to be things are going to go into arbitration. There's a procedure in place, right? So that made the process a little bit easier. Okay. So are there still any limitations and ongoing challenges in the international realm in implementing and enforcing the polluter pays and no harm principles that you're aware of?
Of course, ma'am, the fact of sovereignty.
Hmm.
And generally still, even though there are now new entities with legal personality in the international arena, still the predominant personalities are states.
Our states.
Yeah, although there is a trend, but still, states are the main actor. So, what if a state does not pay? How can you now penalize the state? Is there a police force that can can arrest leaders that represent states who violate international law? So in my study of international law, ma'am, the enforcement of a decision is unlike decisions made by Supreme Courts in states. They do this by means of, let's say, by the other states who perceive the loser in the case as a violator of international law could be ganged upon by other states. So they can impose. Yeah. Thank you for the help, ma'am.
So
Well, but the United Nations is not a world government.
the most effective way to get people to comply is literally to the World Trade Organization.
That's right.
And sometimes states will bully other states by saying, and this actually, one of the first cases, so for just to give you a context, the WTO as it exists today came into being in the 1990s. You had the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs prior to that, post the Second World War. But one of the first cases was actually an environmental case. And this was the US refusing to buy shrimp from the Philippines, from Thailand, and from Pakistan, saying that the shrimp that is coming, the way that the shrimp is farmed in these countries harms sea turtles. And that is why we will not be buying shrimps from these countries, because we think that this is harmful to the environment.
That is the way to implement international law, not the ordinary way of, having them arrested.
Now, this doesn't mean that the US has never seen its, side of sanctions, right? So the EU also has imposed sanctions, bans, whatever WTO procedures for beef that is coming from the US. Why? Because of the hormones that the beef is fed with. And so they've put what are called sanitary and phytosanitary measures about how the beef is raised, and the environmental implications of this beef. And they've put restrictions on the US in the past, and the US has protested against this, right? So the US has like a lot of countries have been really successful in imposing restrictions on the US and US products using the WTO system as well, which is why the US has blocked the appointments of people to the appellate body, primarily because the WTO was ruling in favor of China in some of the last few cases. And so, but the thing is, it's an effective measure. It's an effective way to, if you don't think that a country is acting in the best interests of consumers, or, is engaged in farming or corporate activities that are harmful to the environment, you can always use a WTO as your venue of choice. People will get it when they start losing money, right? So we also have later on cases about the use of waterways, right? And so one of the earliest cases, at least in the modern post-Westphalian era, it's not like there were no transboundary issues in the past, but the first case here is the Lake Lano. I hope that's how you pronounce this. I don't know French. I apologize to French speakers, right? So this is between Spain and France. So as you know, Spain and France share a boundary. They're neighbors. And France plans back in the 1950s to divert water from this lake, which is upstream, to generate hydroelectric power, right? And then return this water to the Carol River, which flows into Spain. Spain believes that this plan would violate its water rights, and under the treaties that it has signed with France, and in arbitration argues that France needed to get prior agreement before starting the construction. Now, when the arbitration tribunal does assessments, they find out actually there isn't really any violation of the treaties, because the water that's diverted is really not that significant, right? It would not change the amount of water that flowed into Spain, and that the 1866 treaties did not take precedence over the general rule that states have sovereignty over their standing and flowing waters, right? So even though France fails, Spain fails, we have some sort of a precedent, so to, as to how, if there's a water related dispute, how do you resolve it, right? Now, we can see that these cases that I mentioned are not really because the states involved or the countries involved care about the animals or the water, right? They're more concerned about their shared resources, right? But this starts changing. And I've mentioned this, that, there are and this starts changing in the 1960s. You have humanity going to the moon, realizing the world's resources are quite limited. You have some books that are published, which I mentioned, I've actually forgotten the name just because I'm tired. It's there in my slides, but there's a really famous scientist who publishes a book, and that talks about how the environment is getting degraded, right? And so I'm sorry, I've literally just forgotten. It's there. But that sort of changes how people think about the environment, about how governments think about the environment. And then they decide, you know what, the environment has its own intrinsic value, right? So this starts changing in the 1960s. However, there are, prior to that even, some environmental protection treaties, but they're intended for economic exploitation, even though they relate to migratory birds or, birds that are useful for agriculture, but it's really because people want to be able to use these birds, right? Then you have the 1940s, in which the United Nations is formed. And then you have, even though there is nothing in the United Nations Charter which talks about the environment, there are there's a Declaration of Human Rights, right? But there is a growing understanding that human rights are intertwined with environmental rights, right? So you eventually have some changes that happen in the US, especially in the UN, especially post the 1960s. At the same time, while we're talking about land, what's equally important is the sea, right? And so you have in the 1950s, in the 1940s, a problem related to whaling. You have these different countries that would like to hunt whales and use them, right? And so what that leads to is the depletion of whales, right? And it becomes increasingly obvious that living resources are exhaustible and they have to be preserved. So what happens back then is that you have the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, which sets up the International Whaling Committee. I've forgotten what the C stands for, but it's still there, right? And it addresses threats to these giant whales that still exist, right? And so regulates the entire environment that whales find themselves in, right? So whales are, for example, sensitive to noise. They are also sensitive to climate change, chemical pollution, marine debris, entanglements if you're fishing, right? And so the convention regulates all of this. And so there is a push to stop commercial whaling, and several countries sign on to this. However, this does not mean that things are perfect. The Japanese decide, you know what, we would like our whales back to eat them, right? And so there have been concerns since the late, at least since 2017, that Japan is actually leaving the convention and would like to go back and eat those whales again. I apologize to anybody of Japanese ancestry. That's just how it is.
So, Prof, if somebody just doesn't sign, that's it?
Yeah. But you know what happens though, is that even though this is the thing with environmental regulations and environmental treaties, right? Once you recognize that something is an international problem, right? And there is some sort of treaty, convention, regulation around it, people do start changing their habits.
That's right.
Right? So even though back in the 1950s, 1940s, it would have been completely normal to whale, right? At this point, we know that it's wrong to do. And even if you are not a part of the convention, it's a part of your ingrained habit to recognize that it's not the nicest thing to do to whales.
Called
Right?
opinion juries. Opinion juries, meaning if it's something is perceived to be law in the international sphere, and people have regarded it as law for a long, long time, it becomes customary norm of international law. Becomes a source, primary source of international law, second only to treaty.
So,
Right.
so that's social innovation.
Yes, in a way.
Yes.
Yes, it's a way, right? Even if these laws are not binding, they do change how people perceive things, right? So when we were talking about the ozone layer in the first session, it was quite common to have these aerosol cans everywhere that were harmful to the environment, but then regulation changes things, right? And everybody knows harming the ozone is a bad thing. It's the same thing with exploiting whales now. Everybody knows it's not the best thing to do. Okay. The 1950s also sees the creation of the International Maritime Organization, which sets up the United Nations. That's going to come later. But it's a specialized agency of the United Nations, and it is responsible for regulating marine transport, but has several environmental frameworks built into this, right? So even though it's meant to be for shipping, it includes, its remit includes maritime safety, environmental concerns, legal matters, technical cooperation, maritime security, and the efficiency of shipping. It also has a Marine Environment Protection Committee, and has adopted the 2004 International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships' Ballast Water and Sediments. Does anyone know what ballast waters are? Okay, you know how ships keep on floating and they don't tilt over? It's because they have something in them called water. So in order to protect them from sinking, they actually have water inside them that keeps them afloat. And this water is called ballast water. So what happens is that if you take water from one jurisdiction, take it from the Pacific, and dump it into the Atlantic, what's going to happen? Any guesses?
The composition of the water may be different.
The composition will be different. You might also have the risk of exposing invasive species
Correct, ma'am.
from one water to another,
Microorganisms. Yes, ma'am.
right? So what that means is that if you have ballast water from one jurisdiction, you can't just go and dump it into another. The IMO also administers the International Convention on Civil Liability for Oil Pollution and Damage, 1969, to ensure that adequate compensation would be available where oil pollution damage was caused by maritime casualties involving oil tankers. This has not, however, always resulted in people who are affected, communities who are affected, actually getting compensation. One of these examples is the case of the polar fishermen in the Philippines that are on, I think, Island Verde, right? There was an oil spill from a tanker that happened a few years ago. And as far as I know, and this is actually an image from that oil spill, so this is what it looks like. And so it has actually affected local communities, local fishing. And as far as I know, they haven't been given, the fishermen in these areas have not been given adequate compensation till yet. So it happened around 4 to 5 years ago. Okay. So again, as with the rest of the earth, getting, its due in terms of recognizing that the environment is important, the sea also starts getting more recognition. In 1967, you have the Torrey Canyon tanker. Do you know about this case? Okay, so it is a tanker which is carrying 120,000 tons of oil, which sinks and destroys much of the marine biological resources between the southern part of the British coast and Normandy. And so what happens is that finally there's a first world nation that gets directly impacted by its own notorious, nefarious environmental activities, right? And so that's when the Western world wakes up and says, we have to be more careful about how we do things. This leads to the implementation of what is now known as the MARPOL Convention. I've actually forgotten the name, but it's the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And it has several annexes. Yes. So, includes preventing oil pollution, controlling pollution by noxious liquid substances, preventing sewage pollution, preventing garbage pollution, so on and so forth, right? This gets implemented in the 1970s. Yes, Judy.
In terms of identifying the polluters and how to prevent further pollution, would you say the ship owners or the the crew inside the ships would be more influential? I don't want to say responsible or accountable, but
So let's think of this as a company law problem, right? If you are indeed going to sue the company, if there has been some sort of environmental damage, and there is some sort of a law or regulation that regulates their activities, who are you going to hold liable? The board or the employees?
so at the end of the day, still the ship owner.
Ship owner.
The ship owner.
The
Right.
ship owners, the board of governors, depending on, what was it really a board level oversight that led to this. In some cases, you can have something called vicarious liability,
Mhm.
right? So it's when an employer can be held liable for the acts of its employees, provided that the employee was acting within the course of the business, and so wasn't doing a frolic or a detour from his actual job requirements. Like, as long as he was doing the job that he was instructed to do, and it led to some sort of damage, the employer can be held liable.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. But then I'm not so hopeful if let's say I have a relationship with a manpower agency supplying the crew to the ships. I really don't have much influence. Not
So this is like a contractor.
yeah.
Okay, contractors, it depends on the jurisdiction, right? But if it also depends on the nature of your contract, right? You will have, what did you put in the contract? What is the extent of the liability that the contract says you have? And then also, depending on, if it's a standardized, if you are the more powerful party in this, and you always have these standardized contracts that you will give to the less powerful party, then in those cases, the contract can actually be construed against you, because you're the party that drafted the contract. So it really depends on the context. It's very contextual.
But last question, ma'am. So in terms of like being a catalyst or a change maker, the manpower agency or the crew doesn't really have much power, much advantage, right? Or much opportunity. They would just be following the lead of someone. Am I reading it correctly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So their business wouldn't be disrupted. If you're the owner of the manpower agency, your business won't be disrupted, and you don't really need to do anything new, don't really need to change anything unless the needs of the ship owners change. Correct.
I think you're thinking about something really specific that I maybe I'm having a hard time translating.
No, I'm thinking of partnering with a manpower agency supplying crew to ships. Or a capstone. I'm looking for the opportunity.
Okay, so the 1980s leads us to the establishment of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which establishes a comprehensive framework for protecting the marine environments and marine living resources. So this also, by the way, is, arbitrates, it leads to the development of ITLOS. UNCLOS leads to the development of ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal on the law of the seas. And the Philippines knows really well about this at the state level because you've had disputes with China about the South China Sea. So I don't want people to fight with their classmates at the end of this. So I'll leave it at that.
We belong to the same learning teams, ma'am.
Yes, you're also in the same.
You don't want to cause any conflict.
Some of this dispute also has to do with how the resources are being exploited between the two countries. So there is an environmental aspect to the South China Sea dispute. And I will leave it at that.
What I do know, ma'am, about the UNCLOS is that the lawyers there who argue before the tribunals, many of them are also engineers, scientists. I was told before because they were recruiting employees from our law school at the time.
Oh.
The officers of the Filipina went there to recruit people who are in the law school, trying to convince them to apply in the UNCLOS. And she informed us that many of the employees in the UNCLOS are not only lawyers, they're also scientists, sociology, marine scientists, or engineers.
That you'll see that this is quite common, especially when you have transboundary disputes related to environmental resources. It won't just comprise of lawyers and won't just comprise of engineers, even though I know my country, at least Pakistan, has been stupid enough not to hire lawyers when they were negotiating the Indus Water Treaty with India. And so I don't know if you've noticed the news right now, but the Indians have decided to suspend the treaty just like 2 or 3 days ago. And I mean, yeah, I'm glad there are no Indians in this cohort right now.
The greatest sin that I committed in India when I was in New Delhi was I mistook a Pakistani for an Indian. I did not know the history of the history between the two nations.
But I do have to mention that the Indus River actually starts in China. So there's a part of us that's hoping maybe just like how the Indians are bullying us, maybe China will start bullying India because it's the upstream country. But no, it's not a good idea. Okay, we'll leave it at that. This is how people act when they're stressed out, especially with international disputes. Anyway, yes, normally you'll have when you're negotiating, you'll have teams that comprise of all sorts of experts that might be relevant, right? And I can tell you the Pakistanis have not been that smart always. So the lawyers, when they were negotiating the treaties, always came from the Indian side, and there were only engineers from the Pakistani side. And this is not how you come up with your teams when you're negotiating at the international level. Anyway, so there are other conventions related to the sea, such as the Oslo Dumping Convention, the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. Then there's also the 1973 Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which I have a case study related to, and you'll study in a lot of detail in a later session of this course. And then you also have the 1971 Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. And there are underground rivers in the Philippines, such as the one that I went to in Palawan, which is regulated by this convention. So if you ever go to any wetland in the Philippines, the Ramsar Convention, which, by the way, Ramsar is in Iran, it regulates the ecological functions of wetlands in relation to water regimes and habitats. Why? Because these wetlands have a lot of biodiversity in them. And by the way, that's the name of the book that I forgot about, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So this is just like, what the global awakening post, just like a, a timeline of the global awakening post, the 1960s looked like. And I've already covered in a previous lecture, the United Nations conference in Stockholm. You also have the Rio summit in the 1990s. And then post 2000, you have the Convention on Biological Diversity. You have the 2005 Kyoto Protocol. Does anyone know what this is about? Has anyone heard of carbon credits? Yes, Judy, what are carbon credits about?
If we do carbon capture to help decarbonize the environment, it can come in the form of carbon credits, just like Bitcoin, for example, and then it can be traded as well. We sell it as a service also to help other companies decarbonize for their environmental compliance. Yeah.
Excellent. So the Kyoto Protocol sets up the international carbon market between states, right? So if you are a developing country, if you're a developed country and you're able to achieve your environmental carbon sequestration goals, able to reduce carbon, you can earn carbon credits and you can sell these carbon credits or, actually allot your carbon credits to developing countries to help them reach their own emissions targets. So this is where we're at in terms of the world, right? You also have other conventions on biodiversity and so on and so forth. It's an evolving landscape. There's also the Declaration on the Human Environment that we see from the 1970s. Then there's the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous wastes and their disposal, which the former President Duterte used to send thousands of tons of waste back to Canada because Canada was not compliant with how they had marked waste. Then you also have the UNEP principles on conservation and harmonious utilization of natural resources, which are shared by 2 or more states. So what that means is that countries should take strict measures to prevent, control, and reduce accidental pollution of transboundary waters. They should inform other affected states of any environmental emergencies or natural events that could harm the receiving state's environment. There should also be joint scientific studies and cooperation to avert grave situations and reduce the effects of emergencies or natural events. Now, in general, there are several principles of international environmental law. Some of them are substantive. We've covered them already. Some of them are procedural, such as cooperation, notification, like the UNEP principle, prior informed consent, such as what France was asking for, Spain was asking for in the Lake Nunu, arbitration that Spain should have told them. And then you can also have environmental impact assessments for any projects. And this is something we're going to cover in a lot of detail in the next lecture. There's, these principles are based on prevention. There are other types of principles that are based more on balancing environmental concerns, right? So there's the polluter pays principle. Then there's like the common but differentiated responsibilities principle between states. Then the principle that everybody has to participate in preserving the environment. And the 4th principle, intergenerational equity, which the Philippines has actually been instrumental in promoting at the international level. Which case? Factron case. Yes, the miners Oposa versus Factron. Why don't you tell us about it?
The gentleman knows more about it. Could you please explain, Adrian? He knows that by heart.
Oh my God. No.
He's
I-
asking
but-
you to do recitals from law school.
Oposa versus Factron.
Okay.
Let me
So this case involves the Manila Bay cleanup. So the miners or the miners who are represented by the
Tony Oposa.
Tony Oposa, yeah.
And who are these miners? Do they have any relationship to Mr. Oposa?
No.
They're his kids.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he brought his kids to court.
Oh, okay. I can't remember. I can't remember the kids, but you know, they're trying to not force. What's the term? Ask MMDA, the Metropolitan Manila Development Authority, to clean up the Manila Bay so that I can't. Zenith is the youngest lawyer here. He should have.
I'll try to.
I just know that
Yeah.
it's about the timber licensing agreement.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that too,
That's
there's a
Manila
timber
Bay
license.
versus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Zenith.
So this is about the group of miners which rallied or lobbied against the issuance of timber licensing agreement by DENR. The only issue that I remember from this is number one, if the clause in the 1987 Constitution is it self executory, and then the second one is if the group of miners have the legal personality in filing
The
of the case.
standing, right?
Yeah, the legal
And
standing.
Mr. Posa, as I understand, I've never met him, but I've heard a lot about him, is known for being quite theatrical in court, right? So the court asks him, does he have standing? So what he does is he brings his own kids, and he also brings, as far as I know, some animals into the court. Local animals, right?
He's
To say,
quirky. He's a bit quirky.
have you met him?
We saw it in a convention in Cebu because we invite international environmental lawyers in Cebu.
Right. So he ends up bringing all of these things into court, his children, animals, and he says, well, these people, these animals, my kids, are directly affected by these logging activities, by the harm to the environment. And so he argues for how there is an intergenerational aspect to the environmental degradation that is happening in Manila Bay, right? And so he argues that the kids have standing and animals have standing. And as far as I know, this case is taught at the first year in Philippines law schools,
First year, man.
right? And what you don't know is that this case is actually taught all over the world when international environmental law is taught.
That's right.
So is it taught as a cautionary tale or a success story?
It's actually, it's taught, you'd be surprised how Mr. Raposa's arguments actually, ended up being argued, like his arguments ended up being used before international tribunals, especially against these multinational companies that were exploiting indigenous resources. And so the Philippines inadvertently, despite still being one of the biggest contributors of plastic waste to the sea, has actually been really pivotal in changing the direction of international environmental law, right? Thanks to Mr. Oposa. And so what Mr. Oposa has also led to, I'm actually going to talk about these later, but is a more ecocentric view of environmental law, right? So there are now cases in other jurisdictions, because Mr. Posa argued that animals have standing and children have standing. There are court cases in places like New Zealand, where rivers are now being recognized as legal persons. You have there was somebody in the Indian Supreme Court, which there was a lawyer who wanted that the court declare the animal kingdom a legal entity, but the Chief Justice thought the argument was really frivolous. So in very Indian style, he asks, what do you want? Animals are not equal to humans. Is your dog equal to you? According to your logic, even trees need to be treated as legal entities, right? So despite the fact that Indians will give deity version, deity version to status to animals, they're not willing to see them as legal entities. And I apologize to anybody with Indian relatives. But it seems like, sort of, there was some sort of balance between,
Although they may be given legal personality, still the humans will be the one to represent them.
So, there's a thing. It goes down to, the question is, how do you see capacity, right? And how do you see personhood, right? Because from the worldview that I come from, capacity or personhood, like personhood is tied to capacity. And in order to have perfect capacity, you not only need to be able to have full rights, but you should also be able to have duties, right? Or to perform them, right? Again, this is like, this is because I was taught in Pakistan. I've come from a very Abrahamic and Islamic background. So when we study Islamic jurisprudence, for example, in Pakistan, we're always taught about, okay, so you're a human being, and the reason why you have perfect legal capacity is that you are not only a vessel to have rights, but you also have obligations towards your community. You have duties towards people around you. And so that is what gives you total capacity as a full-grown human adult, right? This is why you'll say that children have imperfect legal capacity. Why? Because they have human rights, but they don't have obligations the way adults do, right? It's the same way you can recognize that animals have human rights, right? You should treat them in a certain manner, but if you want to give them full capacity, it would also mean that they now have some obligations. Does that make sense?
It does.
Right? But you'll see like all sorts of funny cases. Like there's a 2021 cocaine hippos case. So I know it sounds funny, but basically there was, do you know about Pablo Escobar? He was a Colombian drug pin, right? Drug kingpin. And he illegally imported hippos to Colombia. And the descendants of these hippos were known as the cocaine hippos. When, right, so when Mr. Escobar was killed, the hippos were not relocated, right? And they were left to their own devices in Colombia, causing damage, right? And so the case before a federal judge was whether these hippos could be recognized as interested persons for the purpose of deposing to Ohio wildlife experts. How would you have ruled this case, Mr. Doty?
If I were judge, I'd rule in favor of the hippos. We come from where Oposa came, so we're inclined to
Trying to give the hippo standing?
yes. Oh, maybe rights.
Right.
Ma'am, in any case, in my view is this, although I see the logic that
Mm.
was personality is conferred by law.
Yes.
The reasoning behind this, of course, could be different from different perspectives. But what gives a certain being personality is law. For example, corporations
Yes, exactly.
are also law. States are persons.
Right.
International organizations are persons.
Because the law says they are, right?
Precisely.
And in some cases, even though you have human beings with flesh and blood, they're not recognized as legal persons at the public
Yes, ma'am.
international realm, because they're not recognized as persons by
I read
public
an
international law.
yes, ma'am. I've read of an account. I read an account where women in the United States were not yet included in the term persons in the Bill of Rights.
Yes, that's true. And if you go to you can actually search for this online. You can, for me, this was a shock, right?
Yes.
Because if you go to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, when I first went there you have like these statutes of suffragettes, like women from the suffragette movement, and they're like, the statue is carrying this plaque saying women's are persons too. And I was just shocked, like, what on earth? Like, what does this even mean? But there are this is actual history. Corporations were granted full legal rights before women.
Even black men were given legal personality before women in the
Before
United
women. In the West, right? Yeah, so I mean, you can find a lot of academic papers about what constitutes a person, how should personhood be interpreted. But, just closing, Spain has also recognized animals as sentient beings in 2021.
Sovereignty gives them that power. The ultimate power
Right.
called sovereignty.
And, you could actually say that Mr. Posa has colonized Spanish law. The exact opposite has happened, right?
Yes.
So take that, Spain, right? Okay, with this, thank you for staying here, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.